And welcome everybody to another Nothing Like a Good Book. Something very special today. Look, imagine a world where technology allows for direct interface between the human brain and quantum computers, exponentially increasing the creative abilities of humanity and holding the potential to make war, hunger, poverty, pandemics, and other suffering obsolete, gone. When human capability is so magnified, how does the human ego resist the temptation towards power and control? Can there be a balance between spirit and ego, between artificial intelligence and human consciousness? And what happens if this ultimate technological power gets into the wrong hands? Those who further seek to link minds directly through this quantum computer into an augmented hive mind. Good Lord. Well, Michael Kelley's stunning new novel, The Devil's Calling, it examines these issues and explores the intersections of science and spirituality in the form of an entertaining literary adventure. I'd like to say this is a thrilling sci-fi sequel that pits spirit against ego in a battle for the soul of humanity. I guess it's best not to answer when the devil's calling. Hey, welcome, Michael Kelley. Sounds like a winner, my friend.
Well, thank you very much. After your intro, I want to read the book.
This is from Laura Manning Johnson. Now, she's a former CIA, WMD, weapons of mass destruction analyst, and a DHS, all threats and hazards planner, heavy duty. She's a current adjunct professor at Georgetown University, folks. Guess what she had to say? Michael Kelley, he's delivered a mystical techno thriller that examines the difficulty of living a peaceful and spiritual life side by side with technologies that can strip us of humanity and enable us to be able to beat the forces of evil in the world. My God, there's plenty of them. You want to stop reading so you can catch your breath, but you won't want to be able to. Now, that's a lovely page turner there. That is a ripper of a nice, a critic, isn't it, mate? Well, critique, I guess is the word.
Yeah, and she is. I've met her in a writing group, and she's been very supportive, and I'm very grateful for her kind words.
Your love for literature and creative writing, I think it began when you were in college. What made you, in fact, go into law, though, international business and investment management, instead of pursuing this passion?
Well, it was the 1970s, which is probably your listeners are probably younger than other than the TV show.
Oh, no, you never know.
The 70s. Well, and I was at the University of Pennsylvania. I was doing a lot of reading and English major, some creative writing some poetry. But I had the view and fancy of myself as Bob Dylan or Jackson Brown and the struggling artist. But I also realized that, at least in my case, the struggling artist was also a self-destructive artist. And I came from a family of lawyers. So I think, though I had a passion for writing and poetry and novels and literature, I saw kind of a dead end for me in it, even when I was kind of very immature at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a really fortunate career on Wall Street, international business. It wasn't what people might imagine. It was much more interesting than it sounds. And then was fortunate enough to be able to retire in my 50s and go back to the passion when I had the maturity to write a sustained prose like a novel. And the trilogy came to me kind of almost fully loaded. Obviously, I had to write the chapters and scenes and learn how to write chapters and scenes over the course of the 10 years in my 50s. But it's been a really rewarding and great second chance, second career. And the books themselves are about the arc of the hero, which is going through second chances and moving further and further out of a very circumscribed adolescent life that he started in.
Well, after leaving Wall Street, you did a deep dive into learning about Eastern mysticism and quantum physics. How did that research, impact your life?
Well, Well, it was, the intersection of the two fascinated me, but I started doing yoga and meditation and settling the mind, and was quite interested in quantum physics and Einstein's theories. And if you read much Einstein and his thought experiments, he really was a bit of a mystic. And more and more recently, if you look at Stephen Hawking's and the Big Bang Theory, people forget it's a theory. And currently, I was just reading an article of some scientists calling it a new creation myth. The Big Bang is not necessarily true. It's a theory. So the way quantum physics shows particles at the smallest levels moving in and out of existence is very consistent with some Buddhist spiritual treatise about everything coming from nothing. So it was just fascinating, and came up with a pseudo-scientific theory of everything that is the center of the first book. It goes missing, and the hero and the quantum physicist heroine have to go out in search of it.
That was The Lost Theory, right? The first book?
Yes. And it carries on from there in 9-year segments. And the second book, The Devil's Calling, is 9 years later in 2027, when there's been, as you described in the intro, great advances in AI and brain-computer interfacing.
So how does The Devil's Calling advance and build upon the relationships and ideas introduced in your first book, The Lost Theory?
Well, the arc of the protagonist, it sounds a little grandiose, is to move from, as I said, he's a literature professor at NYU when he starts. He's a widower. He's living a very circumscribed life. And as he moves out in search of the theory of everything, he starts going back to a early challenge that he used to give his students based on Huxley about if self-realization is real and obtainable, how can that not be the focus of your life? Of course, once you have your food, you can breathe and you can shelter yourself. And I assume those come first. But that's kind of the challenge of the books that he keeps coming back to. And the arc is him moving out of this comfort zone, increasingly expanding his practices into science and mysticism, and coming perhaps by the end of the third book to come all the way back to himself and self-realization.
Yeah, I was going to say self-realization, it's an important theme in The Devil's Calling. Why was it important to you to write novels that trace the arc of your protagonist's self-realization?
Well, again, I came to buy into that question of Huxley's, that if this blissful state and self-realization and the end of suffering, as the Buddha promised, and I don't believe it's totally obtainable in this life as long as we're in the physical form. I think you can have glimpses of it and taste of it, but it did become increasingly my focus, and it's just been a wonderful experience to be able to do all the research into the quantum physics, into the mysticism, and for the second book, into the potentials of artificial intelligence. And the third book focuses, it sounds grim, on death, but not death in a grim fashion. And death is perhaps the final liberation.
I want to take an excerpt, if I may, from chapter 2. Let's have a look. With all that had occurred over the 9 years since the publication of Dylan Burns' Theory of Everything and our collaborative novel, The Lost Theory Telepathy was no longer in doubt. Now, Ting looked like a fairy in her light green crop yoga top and darker green yoga pants. A Peter Pan tiger lily of ageless grace. The CIA had secretly used telepathy and remote viewing dating back to the 1980s and was concurrently investing in hologram research. Our science fiction was the government's secret truth. The UFOs we used to imagine our government had known to be true for decades. Tell us a little bit more now about where you were heading with chapter 2.
Well, it's a few things of interest. One, not answering your question directly,
That's
is
right.
The Ting quote is interesting because my biggest criticism has come from the fact that the protagonist is the women are all the strongest characters. He respects and honors women, but he also has thoughts and descriptions of women from their physical form, particularly when he first meets them. And I've been somewhat criticized for that. And it's actually been helpful in a perverse way in that he starts learning over the second book that he doesn't just have to police his actions and words, he needs to police his thoughts a little bit more closely. So that's part of his arc. And I actually come to that growth in my character through the criticism of the first novel in particular. But in answer to your question, the corollary to the self-realization movement of Sean Byron McQueen, our hero, is what I call loosely magic, or it's also called psi science or noetic sciences. Telepathy, precognition, remote viewing. The government has used these things. They're all known to work, but they don't know how it works. So they can be proven statistically beyond a reasonable doubt that there is telepathic communication, there is the ability to have precognition, and they're not understood. But that doesn't mean they don't exist. No. So there's a broad range of that activities and developments over the course of the 9-year segments that you see throughout the books. And it just fascinates me, getting to the scientific concept, which has also been proved, of entanglement, which is two particles separated at a great distance are able to continue to communicate faster than the speed of light instantaneously, which Einstein called spooky action at a distance, but it's real. So I find these things that can't necessarily be explained by science, but can be shown empirically to exist, also very fascinating and very much involved in a life of inquisition.
And the back end of that first excerpt I did too, which touches on what you were talking about in 2020, they finally came clean, disclosing there were flying saucers that they would rebrand as UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena. But in 2026, we'd receive our first direct message from aliens, one that credible scientists and cryptologists agreed it was an announcement of contact for the 9th of the 9th, 36. How'd you come up with that?
Well, it's kind of shamelessly setting up the third book, which is 9 years after this, The Devil's Calling. Mm-hmm. And it's they all occur in the summer of these 9 years. And so there's a real quickening occurring as government and C5 groups are all preparing for this announced arrival and contact with the aliens. And whether they're coming to annihilate us, to enslave us, or to enlighten us, to be determined.
I'd like to think it was the latter, personally.
But it was a shameless setup of the third book.
Mm. You were inspired to write a trilogy, right, that tracks the adventures and arc of the protagonist over a journey of self-realization, quickly realizing that this labor of love would also serve as a catalyst to your own research and practices of meditation and yoga, as you touched on. And in self-realization, is real and obtainable in a lifetime, as you say. A lot of people more and more getting into it overall. I mean, can you explain this shift, if you like, worldwide shift?
Well, I am fascinated by, and some people might write it off to New Age and other, categorized as shallow thinking, but there seems to really be two things going on at the same time. A disruption and a blow up of things like in Russia that you never could have expected to be seeing in our lifetimes again. And, the last gasp of, ego and on the one hand. And on the other hand, I think you're seeing more and more people, discovering yoga, discovering meditation, discovering spirituality in a way that is very encouraging. And so I find that fascinating. I can't predict which one's going to prevail. Obviously, I'm rooting for the spiritual side, but yeah, I think there is a blossoming of human potential and spirit, and perhaps AI and brain-computer interfacing. Perhaps they could be advance that. As well as be misused potentially by egotistical people and maniacal people like the devil's calling may have it.
I'm speaking with Michael Kelley about his new release, The Devil's Calling. You know, both of your works point to the emerging struggle between you and developing technologies and the spirit and consciousness of humanity. Do you think that this struggle will become much clearer in your own lifetime? I know you probably thought it wouldn't, or is this more of a distant future reality for most people? And if I was to say to you then, well, who are your top 10 favorite inspirational, say, influences regarding all that?
Interesting. I do posit, and I was just touching upon to a certain extent, that, I mean, every generation may consider itself potentially the last. I'm sure if you lived through and were during the Cuban Missile Crisis, you may have thought, well, I'm going to be here for the end of the world. And again, I hope the end of the world is a positive transformational leap forward in humanity and not a nuclear conflagration. But my influences are pretty broad from, he is a literature professor in the book, and there's lots of references to the Romantic poets who touched on Eastern mysticism. I don't know that they had direct back and forth with these. I think some of them did have some Buddhist writings that they read and referenced, but they had a whole concept of the sublime, which is basically samdhi, or the state reached by meditators and in Buddhist philosophy. So I've been very influenced by the Romantic poets, William Butler Yeats, who believed in magic, Shakespeare, and all the great literature up to this day. From a spiritual perspective, I think my first kind of eye-opening back while I was still on Wall Street was Eckhart Tolle. I'm a big fan of Ramana Maharishi, who poses the question of I am. And from industry, Elon Musk fascinates me. I don't know whether he's good, bad, or indifferent.
Well, that guy's an alien. I'm convinced of it.
He's certainly a genius.
He's ahead of his time, well and truly. Look, you state that the book is for readers who are looking to have fun and be challenged, right? Now, it won't be interesting if a reader wants a cozy, formulaic genre fiction or a politically correct character who has no room to grow or learn from his experiences. Why don't you clarify that for us, if you would, Michael Kelley?
Yeah, I think all the books could be called Dan Brown-like thriller, but they're not as thrilling as Dan Brown or as formulaic as Dan Brown. Dan Brown uses the third person. This is in the first person, and has that self-realization arc. So you're often getting the thoughts of the hero as well as the action going on around him. So, Mark, would you ask the question again so I make sure I'm going on the right track?
That's all right. That's all right. I really, I'm getting at the fact that, what do other people think? I mean, John J. Kelley is no relation to you whatsoever, I might add, okay? But he's from the Detroit Free Press. This is what he had to say. The Devil's Calling is a brilliant and heart-pounding epic saga of metaphysical science fiction. It's a journey of self-realization and a cautionary tale for generations to come. The kind of book that hooks you from the start and never lets you go until the final sentence of the final page. The sci-fi story pits human-based intelligence against automated thought. It's deep stuff. Do you think the average person's going to be able to get hold of this, to be honest?
Yes, and I think, because I've had friends that are yoga teachers, I've had friends that are lawyers, I've had a friend who calls herself the badass bar wench because she serves she works at a bar, and they've all been fans. And I think one of the key things that I learned by sneaking into my father's library and looking at some of his books early on is you don't have to get every reference. You know, it's sometimes fun if you have time to look up the reference. But if you hear a name from literature that you're not that familiar with, you have a sense generally. John le Carré, he writes kind of, you know, intrigue, Cold War type of spy stuff. So you don't really need to have, you know, it also skims the surface of pop culture and all the rest. And every reference does not have to be fully grasped to enjoy the book.
Well, talking on name dropping, The Devil's Calling, it does mix elements of sci-fi, action, and adventure, along with metaphysical fiction, right? What works of fiction have inspired you as an author?
Well, I think my father used to, keep going back to my father, he was a big reader, very much into the classical canon of Shakespeare, Dickens, Austen. And so those books had kind of been with me, you know, through my childhood and into, you know, my more adult phase. You know, I am a fan of John le Carré. I am a fan of Jennifer Egan's. But you know, reading to my daughter the Hogwarts, you know, the Game of Thrones. Also, Kipling's a little out of favor, but I'm a big fan of Kipling as well. Just the grand adventures and fantasies.
Right. Well, it's character driven, well and truly. Your book, The Devil's Calling, there's no doubt about it. What do you hope your readers will see and learn from the relationships that are portrayed from the lead guy, Sean Byron McQueen, and the other characters, most especially those, let's say, in the family?
Well, the family forms around the course of the first novel and carries through the trilogy. And the family's kind of in the nature of I don't know if I pronounce this right, from the Eastern philosophies, Sangha, Sangha, which is really a spiritual family. And there's some references to...
That's Indian, I think, isn't it?
Yes, to the dark side of that, you know, the Charles Manson type family, but that's not it. It's a true spiritual family, and how that family is focused around, you know, there's a spiritual guide or teacher in it called Juno, who teaches big love. And there's also jokes about that as well, because there's obviously the other big love. So I think that's a fascinating thing, to have that kind of level of commitment to the other spiritual and happiness in this life, without all the baggage of various other types of relationships. There's also a concept from the Course of Miracles in this that is called a holy relationship rather than a marriage relationship, where the focus is on the spiritual advancement of the partner. So it allows for a lot of interesting interactions, and obviously they're human still, so they're not perfect, and there's conflict even within the family, as well as with the other bad characters. Sean quickly comes to focus on what he calls people either falling into the category of love-centric or egocentric. And it's an interesting divide, because he then kind of, since you're in his head, he kind of judges characters in the good or bad bucket. And the family is in the love-centric bucket.
In the few minutes that we've got left, Michael, I'd like to ask you, how do you determine, or develop, if you like, the lead character, Sean Byron McQueen in this case? How do you determine him, you know, to be able to follow through the three adventures of the trilogy?
Not maybe a direct response, but it is interesting to me that as I wrote Sean Byron McQueen, you mentioned Dylan Byrne was the one that came up with the theory of everything. I quickly kill him off in the first book, and his theory goes missing. And he was the one that had kind of my resume and my interests, and because I wanted to separate myself from the protagonist because it's a first person book, and I didn't want my wife and my friends all saying, "Oh, Sean Byron McQueen's you," and then having to defend every thought he has and every action he takes. But I'm still getting a lot of that. I haven't totally avoided by thinking I killed myself off.
Right.
So it's interesting, and he's not me. I mean, I'm not a literature professor. I'm hopefully not quite as adolescent-minded as he is when he starts off. And, you know, I gave him all sorts of character features. I recently heard Lee Child say, one of the biggest mistakes in the series is you fall in love with your character, your lead character, and he becomes more perfect over time. Well, Sean is supposed to be getting better and better, but he never becomes perfect. He's always a bit of a bungling adventure.
Casey Finn, he's from the reader's favorite. He says many writers have a daunting task ahead of them to produce a sequel to a complex and involved first novel, especially one as intriguing as The Lost Theory, your first book. Michael Kelley has risen to the occasion with The Devil's Calling. It's an equally compelling thriller that finds new and exciting ways to raise the stakes and push the development of established characters in different directions. So, in my second closing question to you, I'd like to ask this. What questions do you hope The Devil's Calling helps your readers begin to consider?
Well, there is that big question of self-realization and what it means and whether or not that's going to be a big part of one's life. You know, the option is that self-realization is not real and it's some sort of delusion, which people could reach that conclusion. And also the idea of second chances, that we don't have to become fixed in a circumscribed literature professor with a very small circle of friends, as Sean starts out. And that there are big questions and big mysteries out there that are very inspiring and interesting to explore.
Expand that mind.
Yes, and just because we're getting older doesn't mean we have to stop doing that.
Exactly. So what's next for the career? I mean, can you give us any hints about the upcoming third book in this trilogy? When is that going to be born?
Well, there's lots of love and death throughout the books, and the third book focuses on death and meeting death in a positive fashion, and what death is and what death isn't. It sounds grim, but it's actually one of the most cheery of the three books in tone and content. And I think it's fascinating because the aliens are coming just as he's trying to get out from under a deadly curse that's over his head. So it all is hurtling towards that date of 9/9/36, and it comes. I don't want to say much more about it than that, but it's
it's interesting. 9/9/36, my friend. That's 999. Which is 3 9s are 27, which is 7 2 is a 9. Divided by 3, that's 3. Divided by 3, it's 1. Numerology's heavy.
Yeah, that wasn't lost on me. Then in the second book, I think it is.
All
maybe
right.
the first. 999 is an important. 222 is also important.
Right.
There's a little numerology.
Well, I stick to my 3 6 9, all coupled for my pick 3, so I just stay with those. Listen,
like
Michael Kelley, nothing like a good book here with Mark Bishop. Look, it's sci-fi adventure flavor, emotionally resonant characters in the thing. It's called The Devil's Calling. It invites readers to explore ideas regarding telepathy, consciousness, self-realization, and the implications of emerging technology for humanity. Now, Michael skillfully wraps deep philosophical concepts in a thrilling, engaging journey of self-discovery. Highly recommend this book. Pitting spirit against ego, they'll keep readers in its grip, you, the reader, right through to the last page. And it's an Amazon bestseller in the science fiction and fantasy writing. Well done on that. The Devil's Calling, you get it in a hardcover. Where else and what else can you get it in, Michael?
Well, any bookstore that isn't carrying it already will certainly order it for you. And obviously, I think everyone should support their local bookstores. But Amazon, Barnes and Noble, you can go on my website and click on there, and they'll take you to Amazon.
And that's, incidentally, that's www.michaelkelleyauthor, all one sentence, .com. Got that, folks? Michael Kelley, Kelley. Michael Kelley, author, one sentence, .com. Okay, that's his direct site. You can get the book there and so on and look at all sorts of things. Fabulous. Listen, good luck with this. I think it's a winner. You might even get a nice television series out of this. Who knows?
I hope so. Thank you, Mark.
You're most welcome, Michael Kelley. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Good luck with it. Bye-bye.